Bienvenue, welcome. Thank you everyone for coming to the 76th event of Disrupting Disruptions, the Feminist and Accessible Publishing, Communications, and Technology Speaker and Workshop Series. I'm Dr. Alex Ketchum, and I'm a professor of Feminist and Social Justice Studies at McGill and the organizer of this series. The Feminist and Accessible Publishing, Communications, and Technology Speaker and Workshop Series seeks to bring together scholars, creators, and people in industry working at the intersections of digital humanities, computer science, feminist studies, disability studies, communication studies, LGBTQ studies, history, and critical race theory. I'm so excited to welcome you all. We have one more upcoming event this semester. Our next event is March 15th with Dr. Hannah Sieben on auto intimacy and AI. Keep checking back on our website or follow us on Eventbrite, Facebook, or Twitter for more updates. You can find our full schedule as well as video recordings of our past events at disruptingdisruptions.com. So that's the redirect URL, disruptingdisruptions.com. The other URL is way too long to remember. You can also find our list of sponsors, including Shirk, Milieu, Mila, Rakef, and more. Tonight's event is co-sponsored with the Diggs Lab. So Stephanie Duguay is going to talk about that a bit.
Okay, hi everybody. Yes, I'm Stephanie. I'm an assistant professor in communication studies and the director of the Digital Intimacy, Gender, and Sexuality Diggs Lab at Concordia University. The Diggs Lab aims to understand through empirical research, theory, and creative innovation how digital media, digital technologies, and digital culture are shaping intimate relationships, gender, and sexuality. Dr. Cifor's work aligns with several of the Diggs Lab's research directions. In particular, research that examines how digital media and technologies are shaping representations of sexual identity, which is reflected in her focus on how LGBTQ+ identities and other intersecting identities are represented or not in AIDS activism. Her attention to how digital archives can remediate activist media in new and powerful ways also speaks to the Diggs Lab's aim to explore new digital research methods and approaches. So Dr. Cifor, we're really looking forward to your talk tonight.
Okay, so for everyone in attendance tonight, we have a Q&A option available. So throughout the event, you may type your questions into the question and answer box. And there'll be some time during the second part of the event for Dr. Marika Cifor to answer them. We can't guarantee that every question will be answered, but we're grateful for the discussion that you generate. Thank you also today to our captioner for today, Max. As we welcome you into our homes and our offices through Zoom, and you welcome us into yours, let us be mindful of space and place. As many of you know, past series speakers Suzanne Kite and Jess McLean have pointed to the physical and material impacts of the digital world. While many of the events this semester are virtual or hybrid, everything that we do is tied to the land and the space that we are on. We must always be mindful of the lands that the servers enabling our virtual events are on. Furthermore, as the series seeks to draw attention to power relations that have been invisibilized, it's important to acknowledge Canada's long colonial history and current political practices. This series is affiliated with the Institute for Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies of McGill University. McGill is located in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal, on unceded Kanien'kehá:ka territory. Furthermore, the ongoing organizing efforts by Indigenous communities, water protectors, and people involved in the land back movements make clear the ever-present and ongoing colonial violence in Canada. Interwoven with this history of colonization is one of enslavement and racism. This university's namesake, James McGill, enslaved Black and Indigenous peoples. It was in part from the money he acquired through these violent acts that McGill University was founded. These histories are here with us in this space and inform the conversations we have today. I encourage you to learn more about the lands that you are on. Nativeland.ca is a fantastic resource for beginning. Now for today's event. Dr. Marika Cifor is an assistant professor in the Information School at the University of Washington and an adjunct faculty member in Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies. She is a feminist scholar of archival studies and digital studies. Her research investigates how individuals and communities marginalized by gender, sexuality, race, and ethnicity, and HIV status are represented and how they document and represent themselves in archives and digital cultures. This multidisciplinary scholarship covers how archives and digital technologies and cultures are shaping identities, experiences, and social movements. Today, we will be hearing more about Cifor's book, Viral Cultures, Activist Archiving in the Age of AIDS, which came out in 2022 from the University of Minnesota Press. It's a fantastic book. I'm so excited for today's talk. Dr. Cifor is a brilliant writer who writes so much about feminism in the archives, and I'm just so excited. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Marika Cifor. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Alex and for the invitation, and to Stephanie and the entire DIGS Lab for supporting and co-hosting. And I'm so thrilled that you're all here and that we get to be in conversation. So thank you for your time and attention, and I look forward to conversation at the end of the talk and hopefully in other forums in the future as well. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so that you can see my slides. And I want to acknowledge too, I'm talking to you today from Seattle in Washington State, and I'm on the lands of the Coast Salish peoples, whose shared lands and waters encompass the Duwamish, the Puyallup, Susqueamish, Chuyayup, and Muckleshoot nations. And I thank them for allowing me to be a guest who lives and works in this space. Today, I'm going to briefly introduce my larger book, which, as Alex mentioned, is called Viral Cultures, Activist Archiving in the Age of AIDS. And it came out last summer from the University of Minnesota. And then I'm going to talk briefly about the stakes of critically examining AIDS records and archives, as well as the systems and people that generate, collect, and care for them, and the ways that they're activated, whether by artists, by archivists, by curators, or archivists, and why these records and these archives merit a critical examination at the particular pandemic conjuncture at which we find ourselves presently. And then I'm going to spend most of my time with you today talking about what is the third chapter of the book, which is called An Archival Cure, Care, and Curation in the Visual AIDS Archive Project. So I think we're in a moment where it's particularly important to examine how we document and archive illness and illness politics. My book is the first to critically examine the archives that keep AIDS activisms alive. It supplements what is a growing scholarship on US AIDS activism of the 1980s and 1990s by looking at the archives that have helped preserve and to create a legacy of those radical activities. I draw on both institutional and community-based archives in this work of archival ethnography, which details how contemporary artists, activists, and curators utilize these records and the infrastructures built around them to do work that challenges ableism, capitalism, and racism that continue to undergird the current AIDS crisis, as well as its intersections with other contemporary crises. And I pay due attention to the power structures through which these archives of AIDS activism are mediated, demonstrating how different ideologies, whether technological, biomedical, or cultural, shape the very nature of the archival material and how it's accessed and used. And I'll talk more about this in a moment, but the book in particular develops the concept of vital nostalgia as a form of generative practice and a critical lens to expose how saving this activist past and reanimating it in the digital age matters. And I want to argue that how we document and remember AIDS activism shapes much more than this particular pandemic's past. It dictates presents, futures, and the distribution of life chances amidst viral pandemics. Because again, I know we arrive at this space with a variety of knowledges and expertise and experience. I want to offer just a brief kind of context for AIDS activism in the US and in Canada as well. So HIV was circulating in networks in the 1960s and 1970s in North America, but it was not until 1981 that the US medical community began to recognize what it called clusters of homosexual men who were diagnosed with a set of previously rare opportunistic infections. And we saw in response a mixture of paranoia, scientific ignorance, and all of this is driven, right, by a lack of knowledge about the retrovirus's cause and its means of infection, and by the people who were most impacted. Politicians and the media often amplified these characteristics, leading to widespread discrimination, stigma, violence, and inaction that contributed to what is now a global pandemic. And just as that neglect, stigma, and discrimination was on the rise, and as death counts too were rapidly rising, gay and lesbian communities, among others, organized in response. And by the mid-1980s, we see a rise of oppositional groups arguing that confrontational direct action was required. ACT UP is perhaps the most well-known of these groups, and it was formed in New York City in 1987 and quickly expanded to chapters across the US and the world. And the second chapter of the book, which I won't be talking about as much today, focuses particularly on the kind of politics within ACT UP and how the decision was made for those records to move to the New York Public Library. If folks are curious. And I'm happy to answer questions about that in Q&A as well. But I argue that activist groups came to intervene in nearly every aspect of the AIDS crisis with tremendous effect. I also want to make clear in all of my work that though we often talk about AIDS in a retrospective way, at least in a North American context, we're not talking about a past pandemic, rather situating my own work in the US, right? Where there are more than 1 million people living with HIV, where 36,000 new infections take place every year, and an estimated 700,000 Americans have died. And on a global scale, right, we're talking about even larger numbers, right? 37 million people approximately living with HIV or AIDS, and 35 million people who've lost their lives. And I also want to be clear, right, that there's never been a moment where the distribution of infection, suffering, or death is equitable. Along the lines of along with disparities, right, in access to healthcare and resources, we see the same disparities in HIV infection and in suffering and death along lines of race, class, gender, ability, and cultural and immigration statuses, to name a few. And I want to present another argument as well, though it's not always seen as central. I argue that archiving has always been a vital component of AIDS cultural activism. Without such archives, knowledge would otherwise be marginalized, suppressed, or perhaps even forgotten altogether. And we've seen, right, a rise in books and popular films and exhibitions that explore the significance of AIDS activism, but very few of those projects, right, focus particularly on the archives of which their materials might come from. And so viral cultures, right, focuses on the people as well as the documents that created and shape AIDS archives and cultural productions, whether exhibitions, artworks, digital remediations that animate those records. And it's a project undertaken in a methodology called archival ethnography. It's based on semi-structured interviews, participant observation, archival research, and document analysis that took place within a network of archival collections and collaborations. It's a methodology that allows for me to look at the social, the cultural, the political, the aesthetic, and the technological dimensions of records, as well as the systems that produce and maintain those records, and the ways they're used and reused. And the book focuses particularly on the intersection and interactions of 3 prominent AIDS archives, all based in New York City. And as you can see here, the New York Public Library's Manuscripts and Archives Division, New York University's Fales Library and Special Collections, and the organization I'll be focused on today, Visual AIDS, which is a community-based arts organization that is committed to raising AIDS awareness through visual art, through assisting artists living with HIV, and through preserving artistic legacies. And the book is organized, I call it in a little archives humor, a container list But the book is organized into 5 chapters, and each centers on a case or a series of intertwined cases. Some chapters zooming in on a single archive or even object or event, while others reach across archival institutions, collections, and decades. It's intentional that the book grapples and grows along with the epidemic's own evolution. And it is intentional, too, that it addresses but does not end with cure. We are still living in a paradoxical moment of presumed HIV survivability, of projected epidemic endpoints, and unrelenting devastation. I hope in its structure that the book can help to highlight the enduring importance and presence of the AIDS past in its present and to its future. And in particular, the book contributes knowledge about activist archiving, which names the various activities in which archivists, very broadly defined for me, mobilize archival collections to support activism for social justice aims, and to archiving activism, which names the collection and the maintenance of activist records in archives. And I assert that archives shape our possible presents and futures, and that records hold the power when they're harnessed appropriately, whether by activists, by artists, by curators, or by archivists themselves, through vital nostalgia to be mobilized as forces that can repoliticize AIDS in our present, and therefore reinvest AIDS time with a palpable urgency in North American context. And as promised, the kind of theoretical frame I develop in the book, the analytic, I call vital nostalgia, which I name as a generative practice for interrogating, addressing, and repairing structural power inequities that is grounded in a nostalgia, a bittersweet longing for a past time or a past space. Vital nostalgia names the critical examination of the present through our ongoing relationship to the past. And that's what always fundamentally fascinates me about archives, right, is what does our relationship to the past tell us about our present? How does it shape our possible futures? And I argue that the temporal and affective drag of holding on to the past in such a vital nostalgic practice is about its political potentiality for feeling, imagining, and enacting a different and more just present and future. When activated through processes of vital nostalgia, AIDS archives can showcase how activists and people living with HIV/AIDS are not only coping or struggling, but how they might even be thriving, not as the epidemic ends, but rather as it continues to unfold. Archives have a powerful role to play in developing complex, holistic responses to HIV, ones that I hope can stem further suffering and death and improve life chances and quality for those who are continually marginalized. I want to move now into talking about the third chapter of the book, which focuses particularly on visual AIDS and its archive project. This is a page from the archive project zine entitled The Eternal Question. The zine was created by Frank Moore, a painter and visual AIDS archive project co-founder, who queries, has anyone seen my AZT, DAT, DDI, DDC, 3TC, QVC? This is a litany of pharmaceutical acronyms, which offers a precise chronology of FDA-approved pharmaceuticals for treating people living with HIV/AIDS in the United States. Beginning with AZT in 1987, each new medication, despite high initial hopes, proved to have limited efficacy and a set of nasty side effects. Therapies failed almost universally before the development of a combination of antiretroviral drugs in late 1995, the very same year that Moore had earlier drawn up this list. With characteristic wit, he ends with QVC, the televised home shopping net channel, the only viable remedy left. In the face of unremittingly grave conditions, Moore's archive project co-founder, the art critic David Hirsch, shared with me, quote, "We had to invent our own hope," end quote. I begin here with this story about HIV and incurability so that we can begin to think about the larger significance of cure. And I mean cure in a broader sense than purely medical cure. This is another page of the same zine in which Moore expands his analysis of medical cures attempted for HIV/AIDS by 1995. He divvies up that decade of the 1990s by treatment protocol: 1990, 3 pills and no more alcohol; 1991, 7 pills and a directive not to consume yeast, lactose, sugar, or good stuff. And finally, 1995, a veritable handful of capsules labeled toxic, doesn't work, hair falls out, poison. To talk critically about cure, I want to frame cure drawing from work by scholars and activists in disability studies and in clinical HIV studies alike. Despite divergences in what is understood as an HIV/AIDS cure and how it is to be accomplished, cure and the processes that work towards it are central to the efforts and aspirations of a number of different anti-AIDS constituencies, including people living with HIV and AIDS, activists, medical researchers and physicians, public health officials, as well as governments and NGOs. Whether it's a noun or a verb, when we talk about cure in the context of the late capitalist United States, we're almost inevitably referring to medical cure, to the restoration of health, the eradication of illness, and the removal of disability through medical treatment. In other words, right, what we actually mean is medical cure. Cure has come to signal the outright and enduring elimination of impairment, but also encompasses the normalizing treatments, the curative processes that work to assemble the ill or disabled body or mind into a normative society, embedded deeply in structures of diagnosis, treatment, management, rehabilitation, and prevention. Centered on eradication, cure can operate easily in tandem with violence. Scholarly and activist critiques that challenge cure as part of a medical model of disability that sees it as an individual pathology that can and should be corrected through professional intervention. Today, there is still no HIV/AIDS cure, just more and better treatment protocols for those who want and who have the resources requisite to access and to adhere to them. Even if one day an all-out cure for HIV/AIDS is achieved, whether a vaccine, some other drug, or a technology as we imagined, it would not actually be wholly eradicated. Because as disability thinkers teach us, the memory of disability does not disappear. It does not erase formative experiences. Moreover, as Yoon Kim concludes, cure often does not eliminate the stigma associated with a history of disability and illness, end quote. As is the case in this chapter, I want to talk about something different. A holistic cure for the ills that trouble HIV positive bodies is one, I think, that needs activist archiving. And excuse me for not turning to this quote. I highly recommend Yoon Kim's powerful book, Curative Violence. From the start, visual aids worked through practices of vital nostalgia, remedy, care, and curing, each of which I'll talk about in a moment, to engender a more holistic HIV/AIDS cure that encompasses but reaches beyond medical cure. It was not yet apparent in 1996 when Executive Director Nick Debs wrote these words that would in fact be the year when the combination therapies would prove more effective and would become more widely available on the American market. Yet visual aids was already emphasizing, quote, by cure, we do not mean a medicine that will stop the mechanism of HIV within the human body. We mean a cure for human impulses, those which cause the evisceration of social service agencies for those living with AIDS, the censoring of life by the religious right and the theory-obsessed left, and the material impoverishment of the majority of humankind. And Deb concludes, what we mean is a cure for cruelty and fear. As I will demonstrate here, the archival cure that they advanced through vital nostalgia not only acknowledged disparities in the distribution of crises, but engendered a process of addressing and redressing harms, whether from stigma or discrimination. The kind of holistic cure that that visual aids is issuing a demand for here is essential to responding to an epidemic that is also political, cultural, and biomedical. The Archive Project highlights how, when done through vital nostalgia, activist archiving has material and conceptual affordances. particularly in its imaginative capacities to challenge hatred, discrimination, and stigma born of structural oppression and fear. And I want to talk about cure in 3 sections that are in turn informed by cure's own definition by its multiplicity. First, as a kind of remedy for death. Second, as acts of critical care. And third, as a kind of curing process that enables long-term survival. So first, archives as remedy. And this is the first understanding of cure I want to explore together today. And I turn here to the founding and early development of the Archive Project and the Artist Plus Registry, its digital counterpart, as a remedy for the kind of unbearable loss in the form of day-to-day and individualized stopgap measures. It offers an anecdote for a particular form of a particular kind of death. The archives generated a much needed hope for artists that their work could and would survive in 1994 and 1995, a time when medicine still offered little. This is another page of Franker's zine called Mindfill/Landfill. Here he renders a trash can complete rat. He labels that trash can life's work. In 1994 and 1995, as the project was forming, they were concerned that for many artists living with HIV/AIDS, 2 kinds of death were imminent. First, the death of the physical body, and second, the death of the artistic practice and career. And a toxic combination of health and financial issues meant that many artists stopped or slowed their creative process altogether. In early 1994, Moore asked Hirsch if he would like to start an archive of slides by artists who died or who have HIV/AIDS. This time, to contextualize further, is often in a US context called the crisis's deepest, darkest point. By this point, it's estimated that about 13% of New York City's artists alone were living with HIV or AIDS. And activists had been working for over a decade in which progress where it occurred was often incremental, riddled with doubt, and in which forces of intolerance and apathy always seemed to gain an upper hand. There was also increasing knowledge in this moment of the epidemic's tremendous breadth and depth, all of which together, created conditions for despair and desperation. To the Archive Committee's first meeting at Moore's Loft in Soho, they invited a set of artists, curators, and cultural workers. These early members were drawn from the networks of 2 professional, white, gay, cisgendered men, both enmeshed in Manhattan's art scene. And this meant, the members of the collective often mirrored those identities. Visual Aids and the Archive Committee came together to form the Archive Project formally in fall of 1994. It became the driving directive for the organization, a position it continues to hold today. Generating and collecting photographic documentation of artworks was the primary fix they offered. First, create a kind of matchmaker. He would pair artists and volunteer photographers who would go to an artist's workspace and photograph their work. Visual Aids would then provide copies of slides to the artist and keep another copy for the archives. In the early 1990s, galleries were often the ones to cover the very costly documentation process for the artists they represented. Therefore, possibilities of loss of work were, of course, most acute for artists who did not have art world recognition, a group more likely to include women, people of color, outsider artists. Within the project's very first year, 75 artists had their artworks documented and slides donated along with other records to the archives. There were inherent material limitations and failures to the kind of remedy that Visual Aids was able to offer in the face of rapid and unrelenting devastation. Some members had hoped to offer a permanent exhibition and storage space for artworks, plans that never came to fruition. Not all artists wanted to or could be reached in time. The difficult and sometimes unachievable challenges of working at the clock, maintaining momentum, sustaining funding, and just surviving took a toll. There's another page of the zine called The Archive in which Moore depicts the stacks. He argues there, that archiving the dead's remains, in his words, sucks. if it's always limited in scope and thereby impact, the kind of cure that visual aids was able to offer nonetheless ensured that there would be some kind of record. Grounded in the political commitments of vital nostalgia and attunement to power and the importance of the past in dictating the AIDS present and future, the archives created what was then a new and urgently needed remedy, one that was generated by, for, and with its community, easing some of the hopelessness and the fear about the demise of one's artwork and one's legacy, proffering a much needed hope and thereby, I would argue, a measure of cure. The second sense in which I want to talk about cure is in terms of its relation to care, a particular kind of critical care. The kind of activist archiving visual aids enacted was motivated by this communal care. Care is a kind of structural response. And the archives highlights how the lives of artists living with HIV/AIDS matter, and its content can provide some insight into how to best care for people emotionally, physically, financially. Hirsch shared with me, quote, "AIDS introduced me to a world of constant need, of constant care," end quote. Unable, despite their best efforts, to ameliorate or to resolve embodied experiences of pain or to stem the parade of death, the Archive Project was a form of critical care that community members could offer to their own community of HIV-positive artists. This is photographer Jelen Dugnail sitting on the couch, an HIV-positive man, an archive committee honorary member, whose experiences inspired the archive's particular formulation of care. In the early 1990s, Dugdale's vision was deteriorating, yet with assistance, he was able to make and continue to show photographs. Through the archives, visual aids activists, archivists work to extend the reach of care through documentation and engendering artistic exposure to other artists living with HIV/AIDS, eventually coming to focus particularly on serving HIV-positive women, trans people, people of color, and other artists excluded from more traditional archives, with material and affective support so that they might continue to work and to live. Given its cultural deficits in glamour, its emphasis on interdependence, and inherent failures in the face of resolution imperatives, I would argue that care often does not get its due in accounts of HIV/AIDS activism. Yet it was care that enabled community members to the capacity to resist and to withstand HIV/AIDS. The two parameters for placing records in the archive's care were established from the very start, and they remain the same today. Visual aids collects the records of anyone who identifies themselves first as an artist and second as HIV positive. The latter also requires, implicitly at least, a willingness and an ability to disclose one's HIV status in a publicly accessible archive. What began as caretaking confined within an intimate network of lovers, friends, colleagues, and acquaintances quickly evolved into something more prodigious. In this poster created by Roberto Juarez for the Archive Project, he uses the form of a wanted poster, arguing wanted, dead or alive, playing with floral imagery too. And from the start, right, the project was open to anyone who got in touch, though of course it's never been an equal or equitable representation in ways I'll talk about. But it is by showcasing the very plurality of artistic work and artists, right, that the archive can, as Nelson Santos, the former executive director, described for me, quote, break the stigma of who is living with HIV/AIDS, end quote. Attesting to the sheer variety of people impacted and the myriad AIDS experiences and expressions, the collection expands cultural understandings of the epidemic with due attention to particularity, connection, and context. It's an archive that features many of the most acclaimed artists of the HIV/AIDS canon: Keith Haring, Felix Gonzalez-Torres, David Wojnarowicz, Robert Mapplethorpe, and others. But it's also a collection that includes less well-known artists such as Frank Moore and John Dugdale, who are well-established but lesser known perhaps outside of the art world. But what's really unique about the collection's development policy they enacted is that it does not subscribe to or reproduce a canon. It's open, theoretically at least, to anyone. It therefore, in Santos's words, provides a more democratic opportunity for someone to join. However, he acknowledges it would be misleading or oblivious to say, quote, it's a complete or fully equal representation, end quote. The Archive Project always had and still has class, gender, race, and geographic shortcomings in its representation of AIDS, its activism, and its cultural production. These deficits in CARE's reach are in part produced by and reproduce the ways in which visual AIDS was constituted largely by gay white men. The kinds of foundational biases endure. Nelson Santos estimated for me in 2016 that of about 700 artist numbers at the time, only 50 or so were artists of color. Over the last decade in particular, Visual AIDS has made a conscious and concerted effort to document, collect, and promote minoritized artists' work. However, further work is still needed to provide culturally competent care, to diversify and extend the archive's reach and its representation, and thereby its measures of cure. Providing curatorial care could lead to forms of material and physical care, mobilizing attention to where care is lacking in the contemporary epidemic. And care and curation too have an interesting kind of shared history and etymology, and I think are concepts worth looking at together. The final way in which I want to talk about cure in relation to this AIDS archive today is in the form of what I call curing, right? Which is a form of preservation that ensures the archive's long-term endurance, its accessibility, and its critical consumption. Curing bridges responses that are individual and structural, supporting the aspiration of cure and vibrant life for each individual person, while also assuring the long-term survival of the community as a whole through its good preservation of its works, ideas, and experiences. We knew there were stories that needed to be preserved and retold, not about victims, but about the universes these artists inhabited, Moore wrote 2 years into building the Archive Project. He continued, noting these records must be preserved for both their intrinsic value and their historic AIDS value. Within the context of a holistic cure, the process of curing, for me, names the methods we use to treat a perishable item so as to ensure its long life, to prolong it, and to ensure its consumability. In an archival sense, right, that form of curing comes from the notion, right, of preserving food, in particular meat, right, for its long-term consumption. But in a more archival sense, preservation and curation are two strategies that materially facilitate now and into the future archival endurance and accessibility. Visual Aid's communal approach to curing is in sharp contrast to a medical and pharmaceutical establishment's limited focus on curing through treating individual patients. Activist archivists work towards curing harms, whether stigma, hopelessness, isolation, loss of artistic work and life, breaks in memory transmission, and community breakdown. Records become tools in these cultural workers' hands for individual and collective resilience and empowerment. This is an approach that's strength-based, supporting and celebrating people who are thriving, not despite, but in some cases because of their HIV/AIDS experiences. The Archive Project now houses over 25,000 slides, artist statements, exhibition invitations, brochures, catalogs, and other materials in its archives. In 2008, Visual Aids developed a strategic plan that called for the creation of a digital archive to accompany its analog one. Internally and in conversation with their artist members over 18 months, Visual Aids developed guidelines in line with community values and focused particularly right on the communities whose lives are implicated in these records. The Digital Artist Plus Registry launched in 2012, and it's meticulous in its commitment to ethically and socially responsible digitization that accounts for privacy, disclosure, and concerns that are especially acute when it comes to talking about people living with HIV and AIDS. Curing the acts aimed at prolonging the life objects of information, memory, and feelings, whether they hold those feelings then or whether they provoke them through contemporary and future access, is a kind of temporal mediation. As the examples I'm going to share in a moment will demonstrate, these are part of a strategy that Programs Director Alex Fiallo termed looking back to look forward. And I would argue that's a programming strategy that's directly reflective of digital nostalgia. All of the visual aids staff highlighted for me the recent renewal of public interest in 1980s and 1990s AIDS cultural production and activism. However, they noted, right, this kind of renewal of interest has largely been contained to canonical artists and AIDS arts-based activism. Even as visual aids embraces such attention, Fiallo described for me how the organization actually refuses to let its audiences, quote, get stuck in the historical, end quote. It attempts to emphasize through curation the ongoingness and the unequal burdens of the current epidemic on Black, Latinx, and trans communities in particular. Visual aids promises a dynamic engagement with contemporary social justice movements through its archival activation. For visual aids, social media is an important tool. Mobilizing the archives of the records past on and across Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, Tumblr, and Vimeo variously is a means Fiallo described for me of, quote, reminding folks of the current crisis, end quote. In its curated archives aims to locate and remember and memorialize marginalized lives and to evade and contest their social subordination. Fiallo, who is in charge of very active digital sense of visual aids, described, quote, thinking considerably and consciously about that fact that if I hashtag Keith Haring, we're going to get 100 new followers. But then if I follow that up with photography by Kiala Beja or Jessica Whitbread, then people are going to know these artists living with HIV/AIDS as a result of the kind of exposure we get as an organization that's associated with an artist like Keith Haring. And I'd encourage you, if you get a chance, to spend some time on Visual AIDS Artist Plus Registry, exploring the work and perhaps even curating your own collection within it, as well as with the kind of monthly exhibitions they host by guest curators. There's the kind of sheer breadth and depth and variety of work is really spectacular. A digital slideshow called Radiance Presence, which was the 2015 centerpiece of Visual AIDS Annual Day Without Art, illustrates how leveraging nostalgia for the AIDS past on new media works to recenter the AIDS present. Produced collaboratively with 10 curators, its lead image is the object of much nostalgia. We see here an image of Keith Haring being sexy, flirty, and fun. It's a photograph of him standing shirtless in front of a mural that spells out artist. The face here and his work are famous, but the person behind the camera here, the artist, Juan Manuel Rivera, a Puerto Rican artist member, and Haring's former lover, is less well known. Quote, when we post it to Facebook or we describe and distribute it in the program information, the promotion evokes Keith. And Fiallo articulated that he knew full well that users press play because it's a photo of Keith, end quote. Yet by using the work of an under-recognized artist of color in the collection, it also helps to broaden attention. The video, which circulated digitally and was projected on buildings from the Guggenheim Museum to the Castro Theater, also features a number of textual interventions invoking the current epidemic and statistics. It highlighted two issues of particular attention for ongoing AIDS activism, including HIV criminalization in the United States and Canada. A creative component of the curative process of the archive is the ways that they draw on contemporary attention to an investment of diverse audiences in the ongoing socio-political importance and differential valences in the lived realities of AIDS. The archive's active and evolving commitment to curing the acts that constitute a process of holistic cure is one, right, that focuses on cure in the broadest possible sense, and on enabling a vibrant life for each individual artist whose work is captured, while also assuring a long-term survival of the community as a whole by preserving artworks, ideas, and experiences. In conclusion today, I want to talk a bit more about some of those objects and about one event in particular, and about how it signals the ongoing framing of this archive as an active kind of intervention. In November 2018, I flew to New York for 48 hours to attend Activating the Archive project. This was an event within a series marking Visual Aid's 30th anniversary. The event celebrated the archives as one of their most impactful projects. It featured an intergenerational panel facilitated by Visual Aid staffers Kyle Croft and Tracy Phoenix, and featured Eric Rain, Sir Rodney Sir, Nelson Santos, Charlene Cooper, and David Hirsch. My last-minute trip to New York was prompted by Hirsch's name in the announcement. I'd been eager to interview Hirsch, the project's sole surviving co-founder, during fieldwork in 2015 and 2016, but I hadn't been able to find anything about his whereabouts after the mid-1990s, and neither had staff at the organization. I arranged to meet Hirsch before the event. Even in that first conversation, Hirsch offered tidbits about the archive that are his sole possession. Breaking mid-afternoon and mid-conversation, we agreed to continue our work. At a panel in the rearranged reading room at Bales that night, I sat down in the front among artists, staff, academic, arts activists, and students. Greetings and chatter in the room quieted as Phoenix posed to the panel and the audience the event's central question. How can we activate the Visual Aids Archive Project? How have you activated it in the past? And third, specifically, what does it mean for the archive to be an agent of social change, community building, and empowerment? We all received a handout with the questions, printed along with instructions to respond, whether through a drawing, poem, or prose. From the start, the archives was conceptualized as vital and a kind of AIDS cure, a means to document and stem loss, offer care, redress stigma, fear, and other cruelties, and to engender survival. As the epidemic and the lived experiences of HIV/AIDS have evolved, so too has the archives. Activating the Archive Project was an occasion to celebrate both the archive's past and its present, but true to form, the event reached towards the future as well. The archives community holds the responsibility for collectively envisioning the project's future and what its archival cure might look like. We are living now with the complicated results of drug-driven treatment activism, which aspired to medical cure, whether undertaken by activists, by advocates, by researchers, physicians, or people living with HIV/AIDS themselves. The kind of antiretrovirals that activists helped bring to market are now sold as effective, necessary treatments, one often rounded up to medical cure. Work to eradicate disease often appears to drive pharmaceutical development and production, but often in practice, right, the work of saving lives becomes eclipsed by profit making. Biomedical innovations have gone as far as to render HIV/AIDS sexually non-contagious for those under treatment. Yet it is still highly stigmatized, and those infected with HIV remain subject to structural and social discrimination, hatred, and fear. Disability scholarship has made clear for us, right, that even if we were to achieve a medical cure for individual patients, histories of stigma, violence, and difference cannot and will not be erased. Within a culture steeped by medical cure ideology, there's a deep desire in how to celebrate HIV/AIDS defeat. But we are not actually there, nor will we likely to be there anytime soon. And I want to note that while important art and archiving are not enough, art is a kind of prevention, right? It's laudable, but often reaches at most a very particular audience with certain kinds of educational and class privileges that might not include those put at greatest risk for HIV. Attention from artists and curators has repeatedly failed to bring about a holistic cure. or even write a biomedical one. Appearing only 25 seconds into Radiant Presence, the digital slideshow I talked about a few minutes ago, is artist members Shan Kelly's work entitled With Curators Like These, Who Needs a Cure? The work is a 5x7 wood block topped with a neat resin varnish that includes the artist's semen, a bodily substance that has been deemed dangerous and even deadly. Kelly speaks in his piece to how HIV/AIDS is an everyday experience too complex, diverse, and contradictory to be redressed by archival or curatorial acts alone. His image lingers for a few moments on the computer screens or on the exteriors of famed museums on which it was projected in 2015. The archives and their curative processes, of course, will not alone end discrimination, stigma, or fear, but yet recognizing their constraints does not dismiss the archive's promise as a resource for doing anti-AIDS activism. The archive's curative processes, when steeped in vital nostalgia, operate on multiple registers: remedy, critical care, and curing, as I've talked about today. The archives offers a direct remedy for a kind of artistic death for those impacted by HIV/AIDS by collecting their works. It offers acts of care that respond to diverse needs in the moment, and its curing work enables livable and vibrant lives for individuals and communities by preserving and making visible their works, ideas, and experiences. The kind of holistic cure offered by activist archiving is a promising means of addressing and redressing structural violence. It is a component of an AIDS cure that is actually within our grasp. An archival cure does not offer any kind of simplistic or surefire resolution, but instead provides what I call a kind of blueprint for building different, more just futures. A holistic HIV/AIDS cure requires looking backwards as a means to heal and a way to move forward without moving on for impacted communities. As one of the early artist members and one of the first artists to have his work documented, Eric Rain argued for me, within the pain of documents of disease, there is life. He argued that the archives further does not aspire to preserve its collection, quote, like it's dead, it's history, it's gone. We're preserving it because there's life and essence there, end quote. He continued, if there's no present or future value to be found in the archive, he concludes, then we should, quote, just bury it and let it rot. Thank you so much. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I look forward to questions and conversation. And I'm happy to talk more about the work of visual aids or the book in general, or to think about these in relation to other concepts folks might be interested in.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for such a wonderful presentation. I want to encourage all of the people in attendance to use the Q&A box below. So you should see it at the bottom of your screen, and you can write in any questions there, and we'll read them aloud so we can have them for discussion. So please do. In the meantime, I have a question to kind of get us started. So much of your work centers feminist care ethics in the archives. You touched on this a bit, but can you speak more about your method of archival ethnography, including but not limited to how you chose who you were going to interview, how you approach those kinds of discussions, and how archival ethnography helps you kind of center feminist care ethics in the archives in your work?
Sure, and I should give due credit to Michelle Caswell for a piece we wrote in 2016 together for Archivaria on thinking about models beyond human rights and thinking about what a feminist ethics of care might bring to archival theory and archival practice. And beyond giving credit, of course, to Michelle, I also want to note that there's a Journal of Critical Library and Information Studies special issue from 2021. I think it's 2021 or early 2022, that features much more work and builds upon that kind of foundation to think about what this means for archival work. And I'm deeply grateful and honored that people have found that piece kind of generative to their thinking. it's like the wildest dream of any one who writes things, right? That people take them and find them useful and critique them and build on them in their own work. We don't always get to see it in such an active way. And so for me, also for the students in this room, this project began as my dissertation project. And I was very, very fortunate to have funding from the Social Science Research Council to do pilot research for the dissertation at proposal stage. And at the time, where they brought together folks at the beginning of the summer and the end of the summer who were all in that kind of same stage of writing our dissertation proposals, and gave us funding to go out and do research in between those kind of two meetings. And it was also the very rare grant where you get it and they're like, we thought there was something interesting, exciting there in all your projects, but they all needed something still. And that grant was to support us and developing what that was. And so this project started, it was very deep down an affect theory rabbit hole, and was very struck, and I still love Sarah Ahmed's cultural politics of emotion, and thought I might do something that has similar structure, but in an archival context, in an LGBTQ archives context. And in that book, Sarah Ahmed, right, goes through a series of emotions, right, everything from shame to love to hate. And so I thought looking at AIDS records in New York City in particular, ACT records would be one part of a larger project. But in which these things work, right? You arrive somewhere and you realize that something is not a chapter, it's a whole story, and maybe more than a whole book story, right, in and of itself. And so I was very fortunate to start conversations over the course of the summer research, and then to be able to continue them over the dissertation research. And I think for me, I love archives, I love doing archival research, but I always reach a stage in which I want to talk to and hear from the people who are involved or implicated, or whose lives are impacted by the records. And for me, the kind of process of interviewing, right, is part of that. And I'm so honored to get to hear the stories and to share some of the work that these activists, like the ones I talked about today, did and are doing, right? And for me, that's where, I don't know, the hardest and most beautiful moments of research happen, because it's where, right, people entrust you with their stories and their experiences and the things they just need to say and get off their chest, or the things they struggle to say. And for me, that process, right, really is about a kind of relationality that I think should inform how we work in archives. And I think Jennifer Douglas and others recently edited another special issue of Archivaria on kind of person-centered archival practice, right? And I think that a feminist ethics of care, and whether it's in research or in archival practice or curatorial practice, right, is a way of thinking about how we are responsible to and related to others, right? Whether those others are the creators of records, the users of records, a larger community that surrounds them, the other archivists who work on them, or many others. And so my goal in doing archival ethnography is to be able to tell those kind of complete and nuanced stories, right? That's what an ethnographic approach allows you to, is to do deep, rich, and thick description, but also to like look at both the humans and the systems that those humans create and that shape our records. And so for me, archival ethnography is a way to do that kind of work and to capture all of these different kinds of complex relations between humans and systems and records and how they circulate. And it's not I'm not the first nor the last person to do archival ethnography, but for me, it really powerfully offers a way to tell the kind of deep and rich story of records and how they come to be and what they mean in this moment.
Amazing. That's so wonderful. Did you want to ask a question, or did you want to read one of the questions?
I have a question, but I can also
we
can also answer.
Well, you
ask
whichever you want to do.
I have no answer. Okay, great. Thank you so much. I really appreciated your presentation, Dr. Cifor, and getting to see those archival materials really is quite, brings what's in your book to life. And so, of course, my question is around the digital. And I noted, you said that in 2008, they added the digital archive, and then you showed us some glimpses of kind of, the landing page and the invitation to people to sort of curate that digital archive. And so I guess in terms of what you were talking about kind of earlier in your talk around the functions of the archive as a chance for critical care and a more sort of holistic remedy, so something that is, in the act of archiving, you're also caring for people. I was wondering, in what ways does digital archiving change this? In what ways might it constrain it or extend the practice of critical care?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think an important one, right, as we're nowhere near a world in which everything will be digitized, but many more of our contemporary records, right, are born digital or hybrid in some way. And right, digital worlds raise new and important kinds of ethical questions or amplify questions we maybe should have already had about records and their use, right, and access to them. And I think for me, the way visual aids approached doing digitization was very careful. Prior to kind of a more systematic process in 2008, they had, they're a small organization. They've had kind of 2 to 4 employees, always, right, and the archive is one part of the larger work they do, and until very recently, right, they haven't had a person who focused exclusively on the archives. And I think for them, digitization was a clear way to make the records more widely accessible and to do some of the kind of preservation of what might be fragile photographic materials. But digitization also presented new kinds of opportunities and new kinds of challenges, right? For artists who are not particularly famous or acclaimed, and I think many of the artists in that collection, right, are people who did not make their living as artists, right? But made artistic work and considered themselves artists in some capacity, right? For many of them, the kind of digital archive was the first time that their work was featured online at all, right? And for artists who died before kind of the rise of personal computing, right, they may never have had a website or been represented online. And there were, of course, kind of tremendous opportunities for that work to be engaged new and for new people to become aware of it and new. But it's also, right, a kind, it presents challenges when you're talking about people who are united in part by having an illness, right, that is highly stigmatized, right, and that not everyone is able or willing to be kind of out about their status. And it's very different to be out about your HIV status, right, in the context of a community-based archive, right, where people go to and the office of an arts organization that focuses on HIV/AIDS in Chelsea, right, and it largely services members of that community is very different than, right, being online and having, for some artists, right, they chose visual aids systematically went back and talked to every artist they could find who had contributed materials, right, and some people were kind of regular contributors and updated things, and other people donated things once. And of course, some people are no longer living, or it was their estates who donated the materials to begin with. And so visual aids tried to find every person who could and to ask their permission to put those records online and to have a conversation about it. That's, of course, a long, slow process, and one that becomes really more challenging when we talk about other kinds of records like social media data, right, where we may not know the real names or full identities of different actors, right, and ways that organizations like Documenting the Now have created really useful ethical guidelines to think with. But here they did try to go back and they created kind of memorial pages for artists who are no longer living, they cannot reach, and opted for, as many archives do, kind of putting online and then taking down if people wished. But the people who chose actively not to have their records included in the digital repository were often, the way their staff described it to me, people who have their kind of commercial career that they were in might be damaged by people knowing their status, or people who are educators as well and didn't want that to be the first thing their students found about them when they Googled them. Even if some of those people choose to disclose that, right, like they wanted to be able to disclose on their own terms. And so I think, right, those two brief examples point to some of the kind of opportunities and challenges, and those are still, right, within the relatively contained space of like visual aid's own digital presence. And I think those questions become even more complicated and nuanced, right, when you get to the circulation of materials, right, in kind of wider, less controlled spaces, right, less community-centric spaces. And the last chapter of the book spends a lot more time thinking about the way in which artists remediate records on social media platforms. And that's still something that I'm very interested in, is how we navigate and negotiate access to these records in different kinds of digital space. For instance, right, I've written on Instagram, and I have a doctoral student, Claire McDonald, and I, who are working on a series of papers on AIDS BBSs that, right, again, present again all kinds of interesting ethical challenges and possibilities. And so I think these questions are interesting and important and have potential implications, right, not just for how we engage with records of recent past, but also with contemporary records, right?
Thank you.
Sorry, you're muted
yes,
for that.
For sure, thank you.
Sydney, do you want to read Ashna's question?
Yeah. So Ashna says hi and asks, what are some challenges that you've encountered while doing your research? Are there any limitations you've had to accommodate for?
I mean, I think there are challenges in every research project, but I thank you for that question, Ashna. I think for me, I think there's like practical, and then there's kind of like conceptual challenges, right? Practically, right, we never have as much time or as many resources as we wish we might have to do our work. And this is, I think, both practical and conceptual, but for me, I had complicated feelings about doing a project centered in New York City, though it was a place I had spent time. It's not where I was primarily based. I did my PhD in Los Angeles, and I'm from San Francisco, two places that have two other urban places with strong AIDS collections and AIDS histories. And I worried about doing a project centered in New York City again, as it is the place where there is the most kind of written and acknowledged in AIDS histories. And I have a number of colleagues who are doing really fascinating projects that kind of decenter the urban altogether, or that think about urban spaces in the Midwest and other places, right, that have their own unique AIDS histories. And I spent a year at Bowdoin College in Maine as a postdoc, and I taught a class on AIDS and science policy and culture, and my students there, a number of them did projects about AIDS in Maine that were super fascinating and thought about what AIDS looks like in a very different kind of regional and political context. And so for me, I had some like conceptual hesitations about New York City, but it was the place where at the time the most kind of activation of these records had happened. There was lots of programming and activist interventions and contemporary curation happening with these records. And so for me, that became worth kind of doing work in a space that was explored, and albeit in different ways. And so I think there's also, right, been asked, especially by students who are thinking about doing projects in which they contend with difficult knowledges and difficult records, to how you kind of handle working with records of trauma or records of difficult experiences, how you do that in spaces in thoughtful and careful and ethical ways. And I think doing projects, right, in spaces where people do have strong feelings and strong ties and strong investments means that there are people who are excited to talk to you, who have stories they want to share, where there's records, but it also, right, requires kind of, as probably all projects should, right, careful relationship building and negotiations about kind of disclosure and about navigating where your kind of the narrative you're developing might differ from the narrative that others have about AIDS activism, right? And so I think there are lots of challenges in kind of difficult spaces, but also lots of opportunities in doing work in which people are deeply invested.
Amazing. I may read the next question from an attendee. An anonymous attendee writes, can you speak a bit more about your thoughts and recommendations about how cures our violence, such as how it has reinforced how you work within communities?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I, as I hope was clear in the talk, I'm deeply, deeply indebted to the thinking and activist work of people in disability studies, and especially my thinking, in addition to Yoonjun Kim, whose extraordinary book on cure in a South Korean disabilities context, informs my thinking also to Eli Clare's book, Brilliant Imperfection, which does a beautiful job, I think, of grappling with the complexity of cure. Claire acknowledges, right, how cure is both the thing that saves the lives of some disabled or ill people, right? That is a thing that many disabled or ill people wish, right, for, but it's also a thing that does a great deal of violence, right, because it allows us to fund and to focus on a kind of imagined future in which that disability or that illness is not present, rather than focusing on improving the conditions and structures in which people live, right, and improving their abilities to live kind of full and vibrant lives in the way in which they wish. And so I think cure, right, is really beautifully problematized by disability thinkers, right, as both something that's been kind of a central aspiration and work, and also as a force of violence, right, that allows us to not kind of address what we could actually change to make people's lives better in this present, right? And so for me, right, I think talking about cure, as I wrote a book about illness and illness politics, and HIV occupies a really complex relationship. It has a very complex relationship to categories of disability, as the Canadian artists and thinkers Jessica Whitbread and Alexander McClellan talk about in a collection on AIDS and disability, and about their work with poster virus, which came from the Toronto-based AIDS Action. Now, they write really beautifully about how some people living with HIV have claimed disability, and some people distance themselves from that category. And there are kind of class and other socioeconomic bases often to that, right? For people with like access and privilege, right? You can talk about chronic illness and distance yourself from that category of disability while you're still able to access kind of medical care and other resources. Whereas for other people who are in positions where they depend on access to government support and care, right, they're often required, whether or not they wish to claim this kind of category of disability, to have access to that same kind of care and similar resources. And so I think for me, this is also a really kind of thinking about AIDS and disability together is also worthwhile in part of a larger project about thinking about chronic illness and disability and queer studies together.
Thank you so much. Do you want to?
Okay, we have another question from an anonymous attendee. So thanks, Dr. Cifor. I'm curious about the care for digital records. What are the maintenance plans for some of these specifically digital or electronic records, especially when considering how notoriously difficult digital records are to maintain? How might frameworks of care offer an insight here?
Yeah, those are great questions. And to give again, due credit, Michelle Caswell and I wrote a book chapter that focuses in a collection called Digital Glam, right? That focuses on particular on digital records and how the kind of application of a feminist ethics of care, which we had talked about in earlier work and which others had built upon already. We use that to talk about kind of these kinds of ethical questions in digital archives specifically. And so I think in the same way in which they offer kind of larger insights into kind of notions of care and responsibility, I think that they really call on archivists and others who are in these roles to really kind of do the difficult ethical work, to think about the responsibilities and relationships and the role in which power shapes those, right? As we work with digital and electronic records. And I think my colleagues in the information world who work specifically on preservation, right? I believe it's Trevor Owens, right? Calls digital preservation a process, right? Rather than any kind of, nothing is actually ever preserved, right? It's just in the process of being preserved. So we know a great deal about the preservation of paper and other such materials, and we just have less records also from certain time periods, though people have argued that maybe we actually, in the context of the web, will end up with significant gaps in our knowledge because lots of things will not actually be captured or preserved or maintained, right? And digital records require a level of maintenance that's perhaps even more intensive than analog records, and we know less about them, and the formats evolve quickly, and so they present all sorts of kind of practical challenges as well as ethical ones. And so I think we right, and these kind of community-based organizations are very aware of that, right? And the kinds of resources needed to maintain digital archives are different. And so sometimes organizations like Digital AIDS or excuse me, like Visual AIDS will help artists negotiate relationships with more formal institutions as well. For example, right, one of their kinds of relationships with NYU's Fales Library, which as part of its downtown collection collects on the downtown art scene between the 1970s and the 1990s, as well as some other things. They are a more traditional repository, and they have the resources of, though resources in all archives are constrained, they have the resources of a large private academic institution behind them, and the staff and kind of expertise in some of those spaces. And so they'll refer sometimes collections that are too large, or that they know the fails might have interest in or might have records like this that present kinds of unique challenges. And so they'll work with artists and with kind of more traditional repositories, though that's obviously not the only way forward. And there's lots of interesting examples of collaborations or informal partnerships, right? Also in New York City, Anthony Cocciolo's students at Pratt, for example, right, have worked with the Lesbian History Archives to digitize some of their tapes, but the Lesbian History Archives maintains all kind of ownership and control over those records, and that's something that they navigate as a kind of one-on-one relationship with a particular faculty member. And it's some, right, we also in the kind of digital world, right, see other opportunities, right, fully kind of post-custodial archives that only collect digital records, right, and which allows for them to focus kind of all of their resources and time and attention, right, on that kind of digital work rather than trying to kind of operate in a hybrid model, and allows for different forms of kind of community ownership and stewardship of collections. So I think while there are many, many challenges, there are also like interesting opportunities in the kind of world of digital archives.
Thank you for that. To be mindful of time, maybe just the final question that we got. So you've been highlighting a lot of art in your presentation. And so one person—
I know, and I was like, I'm in the wrong space.
But if you want to shout out any art that you have, or point people to where, if you don't have to like show your house, if you don't want to. I was trying to—
I wish I was like, I'm in my office at home, and I wish I was in my office at work, because I have much more work hanging in my office at work that's age specific. But in lieu of being able to show anything exciting on my walls, I think, because that's probably my other office, I do think the first chapter of the book is focused on a poster from Poster Virus, which was part of Toronto's AIDS Action Now, a larger activist group, and Poster Virus is curated. Yes, and I can, there's lots of digital copies, including one linked that show it in full color, but it's a really fantastic image that I ended up writing an entire chapter about, because it's got so much happening in it, and actually it navigates some of these kinds of questions around the digital and around the circulation of AIDS knowledges on social media. And I highly recommend spending some time with it. It's by two, actually, there are lots of fascinating connections to Canada for some reason in the context of the art age world. It's by two Canadian artists, Vincent Chevalier and Ian Bradley Pubin. And if you Google Your Nostalgia is Killing Me, you'll find lots of work in it. But it's circulated as a digital poster, but also you can find photos of it up, wheat pasted on walls, in the way in which activists used to more often kind of distribute their materials. And then in the final chapter of the book, I focus on three other pieces that I love for different reasons. One by Jess Mack, who's also Canadian, and then one by Kiela Beja and one by Dina Dinigazi. And one is a GIF, one is a series of digital posters, and one is a video piece. And for me, I'm not an art historian, but these kinds of digital objects for me are really important and powerful things to think with. And thinking with objects is often how I start work. I think projects can begin in multiple ways, right? But for me, I often start with an object, and sometimes even if I know the kind of topic I want to explore, an image is really what allows me to kind of begin to kind of think with that. So in more recent work with Kate McKinney and I wrote a paper for Catalyst about viral metaphors, and one of the things I love about collaborating with Kate is they're a media historian, and Kate and I both like thinking of objects. And so we began there. We were like, okay, what kind of COVID memes can we find? What kinds of like interesting objects can we think with? So I am very taken with doing projects that have kind of visual objects and components and thinking with those, whether they're kind of paper-based records or other things. So I'm sorry I don't have more exciting work to show off where I am, but there's lots and lots of great work to look at in the book. And unfortunately, the book doesn't have color images, but you can find all of the images from the book in online spaces too. And before I forget, I wanted to just share the press was kind enough that if you wish to purchase a copy of the book, there is a discount code to do so, and I can go ahead and share that. So lots of other fun images to look at and to think with in that space as well. I always wish I could just get out space to grad students, but unfortunately that's not how academic publishing works. It's not a large money-making operation on any side. But I encourage people to engage with the work of all of the artists in there. I'm so deeply indebted to the work and grateful for the ability to think with it.
Well, amazing. Thank you so much for speaking with us. Thank you everyone for your thoughtful and generous questions. Thank you, Sydney, for writing the tech. Thank you, Max, for doing captions. Thanks, Steph, for co-hosting. And everyone, please join us next week for our probably last event of the semester and with Dr. Hans Even. And yeah, thank you so much. This was so lovely.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate the questions, and I'm always happy to answer others or to be in conversation about the work you're doing via email or on other platforms.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Take care.
Thank you.